Well, good morning. Good to see everybody. So glad you were able to make it to one of the Sunday morning gatherings at Crossway Church. If you're here and it's your first time, or if we haven't had a chance to meet in person yet, let me just introduce myself real quick. My name is TJ, and I am so glad that you are here. I know there are a lot of places you could be and a lot of different things you could be doing, but I'm just so pumped that you came and you joined us this morning. We are in the third week of a 4-week series that we are doing entitled How to Neighbor. And the reason why we're doing this series is because Jesus gave us two huge commands. He told us to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. And then immediately after it, he told us, and love your neighbor as yourself. And he went on to explain that everything that in the law and the prophets, or everything that you and I would call the Bible, everything hangs on those two commandments. So what we're doing is we're talking about that second one, the love your neighbor as yourself one. And the reason why we're doing that is because when you get real honest, sometimes it can be hard to know whether we're getting it right. You know, as we live out our lives, we sometimes find ourselves in a place where we go, man, am I doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? Am I actually doing the things that Jesus intended for me to do when he said, love your neighbor as yourself? And so each week of this series, what we're doing is we are talking about a different group of people. We're talking about people groups. Some of them are different than us. Some of them have needs. They need something from us, but all of them are people that Jesus would point at if he was standing here today, and he would point at that group of people and he would say, hey, them. Those were the neighbors that I was talking about. Those were the people that I was talking about when I said, love your neighbor as yourself. And so in week 1, we talked about how to love somebody of a different race and what that looks like. Last week, we talked about how to love the lonely. And by the way, if you missed either one of those, maybe you're traveling or sick or whatever, you can actually go back online. We have those available for you online. You can go to crosswaychurch.com or crossway.news, or you can find our channel on YouTube and pick it up there. But if you missed one of them, go back and watch it because we talked about some important things. Well, today, I want to talk about another category of people that we are called by God, that we're instructed by Jesus to love as we love ourselves. And today, I want to talk about loving orphans. So let me, for just a minute, probably share some statistics with you that you probably didn't know about orphans. There are 153 million orphans in our world. 153 million. Now, to give you an example, and by the way, this number comes from UNICEF, to give you an example of how much that is, or how many people that is, if we were to take every orphan in the world and place them in the country of Mexico, we would more than double their population overnight. 153 million orphans. Asia actually has the largest amount of orphans at right around or over 61 million. When you move to the United States, when you kind of look at it from a domestic perspective, there are over 400,000 children across America that don't have families in our country. When you move a little bit closer and you move to our state, according to an organization called 200 Million Balloons, there are 5,500 foster children in our state, right in our backyard. Every year, when it comes to foster care nationally, there are 23,000 children who age out of the foster care system. Aging out is different from state to state. Some states it happens at age 18. Sometimes it happens in other states at age 21. But when a kid ages out of foster care, what it means is they're forced into the adult world with no family, no structure, and no support system. The statistics about what happens to kids when they age out is nothing short of troubling. About half of them will end up with a job. Less than 5% of them will get a college degree. Many of them will end up being teenage parents. Many of them will end up incarcerated. And this is the state of orphans in our world. But the problem with statistics and the problem with almost everything that I just shared with you is that it's easy for a statistic to become just that, a number, a statistic. It can be overwhelming and it can lose something along the way for us. It's easy for something to be a statistic and for us to forget that every single one of these kids is a person. A person who has a name, a person who has a face, and a person who has a story. So I want to share with you some of the stories that are represented by these statistics that we just talked about. I'm changing their names to protect their privacy. But I want to tell you about a kid by the name of Jacob. Jacob lost both of his parents to AIDS. Fortunately, he had a grandmother who was interested in taking care of him, and so he wasn't left without help or without guidance. Until the day that it was discovered that Jacob was also HIV positive. Because of the stigma regarding AIDS in the country in which Jacob lives, when it was discovered that he was HIV positive, his grandmother kicked him out of the house and left him to fend for himself. Jacob has absolutely nobody and nothing. He's completely alone. Every single day. According to statistics, every 14 seconds, there's a child in our world that loses a parent to AIDS. A kid just like Jacob. And then there's Pierre. Pierre is a child slave. So he gets up long before the sun comes up and he works hard all day long until after the sun sets. And he does it to please the family that owns him. If he doesn't do what they say, when they say it, and how they say to do it, they beat him severely. Jacob doesn't go to school. Pierre doesn't go to school. Pierre doesn't have a bed. In fact, Pierre isn't even allowed to eat with the family. They feed him, but they make him eat far, far, far away from everybody else. And every single day that Pierre wakes up, probably every waking moment of the day for Pierre, he longs to go back and be with his family. But he's no longer even sure if they're alive. In the poor country in which Pierre lives, there are, according to research, over 300,000 child slaves, just like Pierre. But there are also kids domestically. Let's move all the way to the state of Mississippi. I want to tell you about a kid that I'll call Paul. Paul is 5 years old. And Paul should be living a normal 5-year-old life. Running around, playing, tearing stuff up. But that is not the life that Paul lives. Paul's mom is addicted to drugs and alcohol and is prone to fits of rage. And when she flies into a fit of rage, she abuses Paul on a regular basis. On one particular day, she flies into a fit of rage and she beats Paul so severely with a belt that he can't breathe. Fearing for his life, they rushed him to the emergency room. When he got there, the medical professionals started working on him and trying to do everything they could to save his little life. One of the medical professionals that was there recognized the signs of abuse when they saw it, and so they called Child Protective Services. Child Protective Services showed up and they began to investigate Paul and Paul's life. And when they went to his home, not only did they find signs of abuse and severe neglect and poverty, they discovered that he had a 3-month-old sister that I'll call Sarah. And as it turns out, Paul, at 5 years old, was the sole care provider for his 3-month-old little sister. Paul was the one that bathed her. Paul was the one who changed her diapers. Paul was the one who fed her. Paul was the one who put her to bed at night. Paul was the one who comforted her when she was crying. It's not exactly the life that a 5-year-old kid should be living, but that was Paul's reality. CPS determined that it was time to take him out of the home and place him in a foster home. So Paul packed up all his earthly possessions that could be fit, all of them could be fit into a plastic shopping bag. Everything he owned in this life. Amongst his possessions were a raggedy, worn out pair of shoes that were 2 sizes too small. It hurt his feet every time he wore them, but something was better than nothing, and so he wore them an awful lot and just dealt with the pain. Needless to say, all of his life experiences have impacted him. And so Paul has a hard time trusting people. And when he finds himself in social situations where he's overwhelmed or he gets nervous or he's not sure what to do, he has a knee-jerk reaction. He just runs. He runs away as far and as fast as he possibly can. He's just a scared 5-year-old little boy. They have to watch out for him very carefully because sometimes when he runs, he'll run from one situation into something that's potentially dangerous. On one instance, he actually almost ran directly into oncoming traffic. But he's scared and alone. And every single day, I don't know if Paul would say this way, but every single day, Paul wakes up and he longs for one thing. For somebody, anybody, to just want him. I don't know if you've ever been there, but that's where Paul lives every single day. Day after day after day after day after day after day after day. Paul just wants somebody to want him. And then there's Timothy. Timothy is an 8-month-old little boy. His mom has several severe mental health related issues that keep her from properly caring for Timothy. She neglects him all day, every day. She just leaves him somewhere. Sometimes it's the crib, sometimes it's the swing, sometimes it's the floor. But she just leaves him there. And if it weren't for the neighbor that knew about Timothy's plight and who comes over once or twice a day, Timothy would literally stay there all day, every day, hungry and in his soiled diapers. Because of the neglect that Timothy has experienced, he shows all the signs of what happens in a kid's life when that happens. He doesn't make eye contact with people. In fact, he doesn't really engage with people at all. He just kind of stares out into space with this sort of blank look in his eyes. He also doesn't cry. He doesn't cry out in pain. He doesn't cry out in hunger. He doesn't cry out in loneliness. He used to do that when he was younger, but he'd cry and cry and cry, and nobody ever came. So he's come to the conclusion that it's useless to try to communicate. So he doesn't cry. On top of that, he has eczema. And because of the neglect, the eczema has progressed, and it's pretty severe. It covers his legs, it covers his arms, it covers his back, it covers his neck, it covers parts of his head and even his face. It's gone untreated for so long that his skin has become so thick, it's about as thick as your fingernail. Needless to say, this eczema is a seriously painful situation for young Timothy. He writhes and he wiggles and he's constantly in pain and he itches and he finds it hard, if not impossible, to sleep at night. He spends most of his time sleep deprived. And you know, if Timothy had a loving, caring family, Timothy would be a normal, happy 8-month-old little boy who could actually sleep at night. And then there's Becky. Becky's mom at one point in time was a brilliant, successful person. She was an accountant, and she was good at her job. And for a long time, everything was going just fine for her, but somewhere along the line, she started doing drugs. And I'm sure she didn't plan on becoming addicted to them. I'm sure she was just wanting to have some fun or relieve some stress or a number of other reasons that almost make sense. But she became addicted to the drugs, and the more she did it, the more she wanted, and then before she knew it, it was destroying her life. She lost her job, and she found herself walking around on the streets of Jackson, homeless and without a place, and then before you know it, she's a prostitute in Jackson, Mississippi, selling her body to man after man after man after man after man, just so she can make enough money for the next hit. And then one day, Becky's mom becomes pregnant with Becky. And she makes a courageous decision. She decides, I'm not going to abort the baby. Instead, I'm going to have the baby. So 9 months later, little Becky was born. When Becky was born, it was discovered by the doctors and the medical health professionals that she had both cocaine and marijuana in her system. As it turns out, her mom did drugs during the entire pregnancy. And doctors have cautioned, they said, look, this could manifest itself in different ways in Becky's life down the road. She could have learning disabilities, or she could have behavioral issues. We just don't know, and time will tell. 3 days after Becky was born, Becky's mom walked out of the hospital and out of her life for good. Becky will never know who her biological father is. It's impossible for her to know. And chances are, by the time she gets old enough to want to meet her biological mom will probably no longer be alive. You see, Jacob, Pierre, Paul, Sarah, Timothy, Becky, they're not just numbers. They're a person. They're a person who has a name, they're a person who has a face, and they're a person who has a story. And the reason why I tell you guys all of this is because in the middle of the tragedy, in the middle of the trauma, in the middle of the overwhelming statistics, in the middle of the sad stories, in the middle of all the bad news that I have delivered today, I want you to know that there's good news. And here's the good news. There are more Christians in the world today than there are orphans. There are more Christians, there are more followers of Jesus Christ, there are more churches in the world today than there are orphans who need somebody, anybody, to love them and care for them. The good news is that we're not helpless. The good news is we can actually do something about the plight of orphans in our world. And in fact, I want to take it a little bit step further. Not only can we do something about the orphans in the world, we should do something about the orphans in our world. James, the brother of Jesus, wrote this. He said, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. So James, the brother of Jesus, the one who spent an extraordinary amount of time with Jesus, the one who probably would know better than just about anybody else. He wrote to a group of believers, and here's what he told them. He said, look, if you want to know what religion is, if you want to know what religion looks like when it's practiced in its most pure, most unadulterated form, all you have to do is look for three things as indicators. These, James would insist, are the key indicators of pure and undefiled religion. Do you take care of orphans? Do you take care of widows? And are you keeping yourself from being polluted by the value systems of this world? And that's it. In other words, what James would say to you, if you've ever found yourself in a place where you're sitting down and you're wondering, is God happy with the way that I'm doing this? Is my faith developing the way that God wants? Would God give me a thumbs up, or would God give me a thumbs down? What James would say is it's really very simple. Are you doing three things? Are you caring for orphans? Are you caring for widows? And are you keeping yourself from being polluted by the value systems of our world? James would say to those of us who've looked around at the Christian faith, and we've looked around at churches, and we've wondered to ourselves, and maybe we've wondered out loud, are churches actually doing what God had in mind? When Jesus started the church that would be his movement, that would take the gospel around the world, is this what he pictured? Have we got off course, or are we actually hitting the nail on the head? Are we hitting dead center, or have we gotten derailed somewhere along the way? What James would insist is really there's three criteria to look for. Taking care of orphans, taking care of widows, and keeping yourself from being polluted by the value system of our world. You see, what James wants us to understand is that orphans are not merely a group of people that God cares about. For God, orphans are a priority. And if orphans are a priority for God, then orphans should be a priority for his people. They should be a priority for you and for me, because we are God's answer to the plight of orphans in this world. We are the group of people that God has assigned to do something about it. In fact, here's what I would say. I would say the church is God's plan A, and he didn't put together a plan B because he was very clear. This is what we should be doing. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love the orphan as yourself. For a moment, I want you to imagine and think about with me, what are the issues that are plaguing our world? If you were to put down a list of the issues that are plaguing our world, what would they be? Perhaps you would have a list something like this: broken families, fatherlessness, divorce, poverty, substance abuse, incarceration, homelessness, domestic abuse, gang violence, racism, teenage pregnancy, human trafficking, and maybe the list would go on and on and on. But these are issues that are plaguing our world. And the question I want to pose to you this morning is this: who do you think pays the biggest price for this stuff? Who pays the biggest price for broken families? Who pays the biggest price for substance abuse or domestic abuse or teenage pregnancy or racism or human trafficking? Who pays the biggest price? Kids. Children do. The very ones who had nothing to do with the problems in our world, and the group of people that actually has no power whatsoever to solve the problems in our world, are the ones who pay the heaviest price for the problems that we create in this world. And I think it's for that reason, or at least that's one of the reasons why in Psalms we're told this: defend the weak. I'm going to start over again, and I want you to say it with me. Say, defend the weak. Say it again. Defend the weak and the fatherless. Sounds like orphans to me. uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed, and we're going to talk about that some next week. And then, say this with me, rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Seems pretty simple, doesn't it? I mean, God's been abundantly clear. Defend the weak and the fatherless and rescue the weak and the needy. It's clear, but we kind of live in a world where it's easy to be out of sight, out of mind. I mean, I don't know how your life goes, but I'm guessing it happens just like mine. We get so caught up. We get caught up in our own problems and our own kids and our own job and our own bills and our own things and all the other stuff that we don't even have time to care about the needs of other people. But what I want you to understand, if you don't understand anything else that I've told you today, is that these kids, these orphans in our world, that they matter to God, that He loves them so much more than maybe you can even fathom. In fact, in Psalm chapter 68, there's this interesting description of God that I want you to see. He's called a father to the fatherless and a defender of widows is God in His holy dwelling. And then read this with me. God sets the lonely where? In families. So if I understand this verse correctly, essentially what God's doing is He's looking around the world at the orphans that are there. He's seeing kids like Pierre, who's a child slave, who needs a family because the family that owns him is not a real family to him. And He's looking around for someone, anybody, who's willing to say, yes, God. Yes, I care and I feel the same way you do and I'm willing to do something about it. And God places people. God looks at kids like Paul and Sarah. A kid who every day just wants somebody to want him. And maybe he sits up at night and he prays and he begs, God, look, would you just give me somebody, anybody? I'm not picky. I just want a family. And God takes somebody like Paul and his little sister Sarah, and he looks around the world for somebody whose heart beats the same way his does for orphans and for people in need, people who are willing to rescue the needy. And He places them. He just does it over and over and over and over again. So I've got a question for you. Since God sets the lonely in families, what if yours is the home He wants to place them in? What if your family is the one that He wants to place them in? What if God intends for you to be the answer to some kid's prayer for a family? Because God's in the business of doing this. Now, it's normally at this point in the conversation where people go, whoa, TJ, slow the train. Slow your roll. Look, I don't feel called by God. I don't feel called by God to do foster care. I don't feel called by God to adopt. I just, I get that we need to care for orphans, but that's not me. And can I say this, if that's where you're coming from, some of you are right. I don't mean it mean, but some of you, maybe many of us, maybe shouldn't do foster care and we shouldn't adopt. But before you decide this isn't me, it's not for me, God's not calling me to this, would you pray about it? I mean, I'm asking you to pray about it before you decide. And I'm not asking you to do that thing that we do when you become like this professional Christian where somebody asks you to do something, to pray about something that you don't really want to do. And so you agree to pray about it, but you're not going to pray about it because you already decided in your mind. So weeks go by, they come back and they ask you, hey, so did you pray about it? You're like, yeah. What'd God say? God said no, That's not the type of prayer I'm asking you to pray. I'm asking you to legitimately pray before you decide. Just simply go, God, Clearly you care about orphans. And clearly as a follower of Jesus Christ, I'm supposed to care about orphans too. And I'm just wanting to know, God, are you wanting to place them in my family? Are you wanting me to get involved at the foster care level or at the adoption level? I'm asking you just to pray that prayer first. And let me tell you why. In the beginning, I told you about a little girl named Becky. But Becky's not her real name. Her real name is Brooklyn. And she came into my home when she was 11 weeks old as my foster daughter. And a year later, we adopted her. But fostering and adoption was something that I never thought that I would do. In fact, I had a list of things that I felt God had called me to never do, and that was like right at the top of the list. But somewhere along the line, I actually did what I'm asking you to do. I couldn't ignore what God said about it, and so I just started praying, God, what is it that you want me to do? And he led me down a path that I never thought I would go down. And now there's this amazing 6-year-old little girl who's my daughter, and I'm her daddy. And she is easily the best thing, one of the best things that has ever happened to me. And I'm so glad that I prayed before I decided. You see, I know what God could do in your life. He could take you down a path you wouldn't go down on your own, but it would be something that you might never, ever, ever, ever regret. I don't. So would you pray first before you decide? Almost always at this point in the conversation, someone says, well, I don't know if I could do foster care because I don't know if I could just fall in love with a kid and then turn him over and my heart would get broken. And the truth is, if you got involved in foster care, your heart will get broken. I don't know a single person who's done it for any length of time that hasn't gotten their heart broken. In fact, I kind of believe that if it doesn't hurt, you're not doing it right. But since when? Since when did serving God or serving other people, since when did it become about our convenience or our personal comfort? I mean, Jesus promised us a lot of things if we follow him. Convenience and being the ability to stay in our comfort zone weren't in the list. In fact, he actually promised, look, if you follow me, things are going to be inconvenient and you're not going to be able to stay in your comfort zone if you really follow me. We have got to stop defending our hearts from breaking when there's a kid whose heart needs healing. We have got to stop doing that. If you decide to do foster care or adoption, let me promise you 2 things. Number 1, it won't be easy. It will not be easy. It will be inconvenient. There will be times where you're like, what am I doing? Have I lost my mind? I can't believe I signed up for this. There'll be times where you feel overwhelmed. There's going to be a whole bunch of times where you feel uncertain. There's going to be times where you really seriously consider calling the caseworker and say, come get this kid right now. I can't do this. All of that stuff is going to happen. It's not going to be easy. But I want to make you one more promise about foster care. Every kid is worth it. Every kid is worth it. They matter to God, and they should matter to us. But again, the reality is that not all of us can or should foster or adopt. Not all of us can or should do that. But here's the thing. Every single one of us can and should do something regarding orphans. Every one of us can and should be active in loving orphans as we love ourselves.